So, welcome. Today I'm talking to Rann Miller, who's an author and a freelance writer and an educator and an educational researcher. He's also a husband and a father and a devoted family man, and he's from Southern New Jersey, so he might be feeling not so great about the Phillies right now, but he's also the founder and administrator of the Urban Education Mixtape. I met Rand because I was doing some research for my book, Gaslights and Dog Whistles, Standing Up for Facts Over Fiction in a Fearful and Divided World. And I was doing some research just on what other people had said about how people defend themselves against kind of the reality of critical race theory and defend themselves against the real world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Rand had written an article about what he called the three arguments about how people kind of deflect conversations and redirect conversations to get off of talking about the real history of racism and discrimination and all that stuff. And I loved what he wrote and ended up using it in my book. And I renamed it. I added some of my own stuff to it and renamed it and called it the kind of the four defenses of what people that are kind of anti-critical race theory skeptics use as defenses. And I actually published the book and then didn't reach Rand until after I got the book published and said, I hope you're okay with this. I gave you credit, but I loved what you said and I wanted to use it. And he was gracious enough to say, of course. But Rand, as a result of that, I really looked into a lot of Rand's work and his writing and his philosophy as an educator. And I was just so inspired by him. And when I called him and we finally had a talk, he was gracious enough to give me some time and to give us time today to talk about what he's up to and what he does. So, Rand, welcome, and I'm just so appreciative of you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. Well, you do a lot. So if you don't mind, let's just start with however you want to describe it, the world you live in and what you're working on. You know, we have obviously people that are going to be educators to be curious about that. We got people that are in the corporate D&I space. They'll be interested in what you're doing that kind of crosses over. So can you share with us a little bit about what you do for a living and all the different things that you do?
Sure. I work for a charter school district located in Camden City, New Jersey, and I wear many hats. I'll start from the macro to the micro. So people might not agree with that, but that's how I look at it. Macro speaking, I am the DEI as well as anti-bias director for the district. So I work throughout working with teachers and administrators on tackling DEI issues, anti-bias issues, working with students where we don't necessarily, give them the sort of punitive punishments for doing certain things. We try to do restorative justice with them, education, sensitivity training. We do the same thing with teachers and helping them with their curricula and how to introduce or, bring in culturally competent materials, culturally responsive materials into the classroom, sort of integrating those materials in there. So that's the big job. I guess the middle of that would be I am the, what do you call that? It's like the department chair of the humanities departments here at our high school within the district. So I work with the English and history, foreign language, and the arts departments. And just doing some of the DEI work that I do on the macro level, doing it with them also, and then doing all the administrative work that comes along with being a director of department chair. And then lastly, which is probably my favorite portion of my work, I teach advanced placement U.S. history to a group of sophomore students. And so my job is to prepare them for college level work. We have a program here at our district called College Now, where students take honors courses their freshman year, AP courses their sophomore year, and then their junior and senior years, they're taking college courses at the local community college, which has a partnership with our school. And they graduate with an associate's degree from the community college, in addition to graduating with us with their high school diploma. So that way they can go ahead and they have a 2-year start on a 4-year education. And so my job specifically is to introduce to young people those sophomores college level work. We write papers, numerous papers. We're reading books, not so much textbooks. They may get a couple of notes as well. And we also engage in debating activities. So I really focus on writing, research, public speaking. That's really what I'm looking to do with them to get them prepared. So that's the day job. And then, of course, on the side, I do a lot of freelance writing. I've been published a number of different places. And I've been working the past few months on a book. It's called Resistance Stories from Black History for Kids, and really focusing on the idea of resistance in the sort of Black experience, and instead of focusing on sort of the normal ways that we think about Black history, we're really focusing on how Black people resisted throughout our history, specifically looking at time in the United States. So that's coming out. I'm excited about that, but still writing as well on the side. And I was just, happy that you saw that article and reached out. And certainly I always enjoy talking if folks are really open to discussing. I'm always open to that. So it was great for you to reach out for us.
Thanks. And we'll make sure to put the name of the book and the link of the book in this so that people can find it and pre-order it. Is it up for pre-sale yet?
It's up for pre-order, Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
Awesome. Great. Good. Yeah. So Rann, just at a real personal level, one of the things I noticed about your work, which of course makes sense, but it's so different than my experience because of where I grew up and stuff, is like, you're a teacher, you're a world class, you're doing great stuff. And you also have a strong focus on helping kids of color, and particularly Black kids, understand history in a different way. And I have to tell you, my first reaction was, whoa, he's doing a lot of stuff about that's really specific to Black kids. And I don't know why I noticed that, except for my own bias, because all of a sudden, instead of this kind of generic version of history as a white person, I'm going, oh, here's the African-American man talking to African-American kids about what part of history matters to them, which I think is great. But my first reaction was, a little racist probably. And I'm curious if you run into that at all with people saying, well, how come you're not just teaching the regular history?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't run into too much of that. So let me tackle that from two different perspectives. First, I think what I try to do is, one, teach young people just history in general. And when I say history, I mean more of an accurate telling of history.
The whole history.
Yeah, the good, the bad, the ugly.
Right.
Try to teach all of that. And my focus, particularly with my AP history students, it's U.S. history that we talk about. So, I'm able to focus on some of the things that, you don't often hear about. And I didn't have to read a book to find out what's not being taught. I just could go back in my own memory and remember what I didn't learn, and how some of the things that I did get that were wonderful to hear really opened up my mind about things. I didn't learn that till college. So what I try is provide that for young people, and talk about the whole gambit. And it doesn't matter who's in front of you, whether they're Black, white, Latino, Asian, they need to know the whole story, because everybody's story is baked in. That's the first part. The second part is what I like to do specific to Black history is I really want to focus on, going away from what we often hear when we hear Black history. We often hear about the first Black person to do this, first Black person to do that. Right. We often hear about famous Black entertainers, famous Black athletes, things of that nature, right? And then we often hear about how, Black people were recipients of this level of benevolence from the United States with respect to freedom and equality and things of that nature. The story is always told that it was, the United States that worked with Black people to provide them the freedoms that we have, when in reality, it's Black people that have driven democracy in this country. It's Black people who, in their personal experiences, have snatched freedom for themselves. And those are the kind of stories and histories that I like to tell when I'm teaching. If I could give a third thing, my district is heavily Latino. We do have a good portion of African Americans in our school district. But one of the things that I like to bridge is the idea of the African diaspora. And a lot of kids don't realize that, the diaspora covers the entire Western hemisphere of Africans that were brought here to be enslaved. So I try to go through those connections of the Africanisms and the African history and the African culture that is throughout all of us as members of the diaspora, to really open their eyes for them to see that we have more in common than we think.
Yeah. The I think that I didn't say it as well as I would have liked to at the beginning. I think what I was trying to say about my experience was I grew up in Virginia. I grew up like 200, I mean, I don't know how far it is, 250, maybe 300 miles from you. And my version of history was incredibly white centric.
Mm.
And it was a longer time ago, right? So I'm older, so it was a while ago. But it was very, very white centric. And the way you described it, it's like we heard about firsts, right? We heard about all the firsts, but that was kind of it. And we lived down the road from Mount Vernon, you know, and the kids that were African American that went to my school lived in the village that was where enslaved people that worked at Mount Vernon, that they were in the same location. So there was a rich history there that we never, ever, ever heard about. So my experience around hearing about the history that you teach, which is really just the whole history. It's not like it's Black centric history. It's just the whole history, you know.
Yeah.
That history caught me by surprise, and it still catches me by surprise. And it makes me realize just how much, if we really want to, particularly if we live in some states right now that are suppressing talking about the real history, you have to aggressively work to go find out what really happened. And in some states, like I'm doing some work with some systems in Texas and in Florida, and those systems right now they're under attack. You know, the teachers are like just trying to figure out what can they get away with saying without being sanctioned or dismissed.
Yeah.
Just shocking, you know. And I'm assuming that where you are, it sounds like there's a lot of invitation to talk about the real history of the country, and that you don't meet a lot of resistance. At least I hope not. Is that true?
I mean, you know, it depends. There are pockets. I think one of the trappings of looking at the United States as simply blue state, red state is that, you know, you sort of ignore or don't realize the various pockets when you dive deep into this sort of, you know, aggregate of the state, right? And so there are if to use the term, red pockets in New Jersey and South Jersey as there are blue throughout. And I think a better understanding is more or less the demographics, racial demographics, which can tend to dictate political leanings.
Yeah.
And so depending on where folks are, places like Camden, Newark, Atlantic City, I'm thinking Vineland, Trenton, Patterson. Not that folks are familiar with these areas, but your audience, but those are heavily African American and Latino areas, whereas the rural areas, not so much, right? And so that's the pushback against what I'm doing versus where I'm located, where there is really no pushback, although there are sort of nuances that play a part. And I think that those get to other issues, like, for example, when we talk about the demographics of who's in the classroom in terms of teachers, that can heavily dictate what's being taught and what's not taught, whether or not there's an invitation to teach the kind of history that I'm teaching. Everybody's not familiar with what I'm teaching. Everybody doesn't know. It's not always because folks are blatantly racist, although there is some of that. But I've come across in my experiences that folks just are unaware of the history because they haven't been taught the history. And so this lack of accuracy in teaching is perpetuated throughout generation to generation. And it doesn't just harm Black and brown people, but it also harms white people.
Yeah. I used to call that, in my more politically correct days, I used to call that innocent ignorance, that people like me had innocent ignorance. But, you know, given everything that we've learned, and thanks to the work of people like you and you, it's not innocent ignorance. It's willful ignorance. It's like you have to really want to avoid understanding what really happened in history. I'm actually surprised here. So what I'm hearing you say also is that there is no standard around what history teachers in your system teach. They can teach their variation of history, and that probably there is a variation of history based on who's teaching it. Is that true?
So it all depends. We do have, like every state, you know, a set of standards. In New Jersey, we actually have a commission called the Amistad Commission that provides resources for teachers across the state, and that mandates that teachers teach Black history throughout the school year. But I think that there isn't as much guidance on how to do it. The resources are there, the mandate is there, but the guidance
Mm,
is strong. And that's not, I don't think, a part of the commission's fault. I think that the state isn't quite sure about how to go about teaching or enforcing this idea of teaching Black history to students, or teaching history the way it should be taught to students. And a lot of that is political. A lot of that has to do with, there are races to be won and ran. And if you don't want to upset a particular member of your electorate, you might do things a little bit differently. You might not push as hard in some ways and others. So I think that politics plays a part. But I do agree that in my experiences working in various districts, teachers have a lot of autonomy in terms of what they would teach in terms of the history and sort of where they want to go, right? And I don't think that it's a matter of folks intentionally trying to not teach certain things per se. There may be some teachers who are not teaching things in particularly, but I think for the most part, you give teachers maybe a curriculum, possibly if you have that, and you say, here's the history curriculum, here's what you're supposed to teach for your class, and that's what they go ahead and teach. There's a lot of intellectual work involved in teaching true, accurate history about various peoples in the experience of America. It requires you to really do intellectual work reading. It requires you to read a lot of books, and you may or may not have time to do that, right? It requires you to sort of unpack what you read and what you think by having conversations with folks. You don't
right.
often get the opportunity to do that, right? When you're working a job and you have a family and all those sort of things. So there's a level of intellectual work that folks may not want to do or cannot do to really hone their understanding of history, where they can then return key it and give it to
Right.
kids.
Yeah. And one of the things I noticed talking to white teachers about this, particularly in embattled school districts where there's a lot of pressure to not teach about the history of discrimination or enslavement or civil rights, is they find themselves really having to think how much of it can they put in and have that be okay, which is, it's not something they learned in college. Most of the even the university curricula didn't really talk about a lot of that for many of them. So I was just thinking, what a load. I mean, in addition to the under-resourcing that we currently have in public education for teachers around the country, now you're in a district that you're trying to thread the needle around teaching the real history without losing your job.
Yeah.
It's like, and it's not, again, like you said, it's not like we're teaching a version of history. We're just actually trying to teach the whole history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, which incidentally, even in the white centric version of, there's plenty of good, bad, and ugly. So I don't know why all of a sudden it's like, we can't talk about enslavement and everything else because it'll traumatize our kids. It's like, well, there's plenty of trauma going on, but there's enough trauma to go around.
Yeah.
So, and the
Yeah.
way it's taught, of course, is artfully taught. Whenever teachers are talking about sensitive subjects, they almost always know the context and know how to present that information. So,
Sure. I think that the trauma in those textbooks are controlled. So I think that because they're controlled, folks are okay with it.
right,
Uh, and so and then again, of course, there's capitalism at play there.
right,
The book companies want those deals to make those books, and so depending on who the politicians are, they're not going to ruffle any feathers because they want
right,
those contracts. So, that's a broader conversation to have, but capitalism plays a huge part, particularly racial capitalism. That's a whole nother discussion, but it plays a major part in some of the information that we learn and that we hear.
right,
Uh, but to your point, I think at the end of the day, this is really a matter of perpetuating ignorance for the purposes of maintaining control. If you look at the racial composition of this country, who we would categorize as white people are going to be the minority in about 15 to 20 years. They're already the minority in terms of school students in public schools throughout the country. And so there is this fear. There is this real fear backed by survey research, empirical research, where white people feel like they will lose power, not just lose power, but lose sort of their identity and what this country was created for. There are a lot of white people who think that this country is a white person's country. There are Supreme Court decisions, opinions that have said such,
Right.
right? And so people are a little bit nervous, and that a little bit nervous. They're very nervous. That's what we saw on January 6th, right? You saw an electorate made up of Black people and Latinos and Native Americans and folks that came out, and particularly Black people who pushed in states like Georgia and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Arizona that really swung the election, right?
Right.
A couple of years ago. And that was the backlash. And so it's not so much that there isn't any trauma in those old textbooks. There are, but not as much as could be. And
Right.
so what we're seeing is with this swing in the country's demographics, as well as the change in the times where people are more open, including white people, to having these sort of discussions and honoring what the truth is, the old guard is very much concerned. And so now there's this shift of, hey, we need to go ahead and change the narrative. And unfortunately, you have politicians, conservative politicians, taking advantage of um, poor or I'm going to be careful with my words, folks that aren't as versed in the history whereby their whiteness is taken advantage
Right.
of. And there have been people, Lyndon Johnson, who has said things to that. I don't remember the quote, but he's made mention of saying that you can go ahead, and I'm paraphrasing here, use whiteness as a way to make a white person go about things politically. Lee Atwater talked about a Southern strategy
Right.
where
Right.
he was using whiteness to benefit, politically, the Republican Party. So this stuff is not new. This
No,
stuff
no,
is
no, no. Yeah. Yeah.
old, just reshaped, reformed, and that's really what we're seeing with this fight against critical race theory, which is not taught in schools, by the way.
Right. And if it was taught in schools, it wouldn't be what people are characterizing anyway. It would have been, it's the notion that discrimination is systemic and that it's baked, as you said earlier, it's baked into the way that we work. It's baked into the way that we think and how society is structured. And
Right.
I think, one of the things I think that you said that's really powerful about just kind of how things are shifting in terms of the demographics is I try to kind of, when I get despondent about it and what's happening and the how much effort we're still having to make progress on some of these things is and the amount of resistance that we're currently feeling is at the end of the day, I think some of this is kind of the end stages of minority rule. It's like it's people resisting because the numbers are shifting. We're gonna be in a society that looks different. And for people that look like me, for many of us, because of the way we grew up, we're going to be uncomfortable with that. Okay, let's deal with the discomfort. Let's not try and make it necessary. We can't make it go away. It's not going to go away. So how do we normalize it and make it part of the process as we learn to do this together? There is no choice around that. We're going to have to.
Yeah. I think that's a good question. It's a tough question. It's going to require that folks, particularly white folks, be honest about what's happening and what they see. For example, the time that we're recording this podcast is election day. We have laws on the books that are preventing people of color, particularly Black people, from voting, right? We have laws on the books that sort of rig congressional districts. That's gerrymandering. So that way, Black people are all put in one district, and then white people are split into multiple districts. So that way the balance can be shifted.
Right.
So it's not as much for Black people. Those things happen. There are voter ID laws in communities where Black people live, where people of color live, to prevent them from going to vote. There are people that are appearing at polling stations to intimidate and scare folks. There are folks that are working these polls that are not counting certain votes. And then there are politicians who are saying, we're not going to observe the will of the people and we'll overturn the election or sue if we have to. And those are real tactics And we have to ask the question, well, who do these things benefit? Are they benefiting everybody? Are they benefiting people
Right.
of color, white people, or are they only benefiting white people? So I
Right.
give that example as, if folks are really concerned about the way that this country is going, then they need to go out and do the things to help prevent these things from happening. And again, it's election day. Voting helps to do that. When you
Right.
go out and vote, you can go put certain people in positions of power and authority, and then it's your job after the vote that you keep the pressure on them to do what they said they would do for you. And
Yeah.
it's not for you, but for other people too. And so, if we're going to move past this as a country, then we're going to have to acknowledge the truths that are out there. And once we can acknowledge it, understand the history as to why it's happening,
Right.
and then use that information to be empowered to do what we need to do on behalf of all people.
Right.
And it's just not happening right now.
It's not, and I don't want to go down too much more down this kind of road because it's just after a while it just gets so depressing. But it's like the people that really have to stand up and start doing something about this and calling this out are people that look like me, right? It's got to be. We can't keep on relying on. I mean, people say, "Well, what about Black Lives Matter?" It's like, well, Black Lives Matter is about paying attention to a different element of this. It's not the jobs of people, men and women of color, to help figure out how to undo the problems that were caused in our culture by my ancestors, right?
Mhm.
It's up to us, and we're the insider group, we're the dominant group, we're the group that actually has some of the culturally installed authority and power to make a shift on it. So when I see people not standing up for it, people who do have the authority and power, and then in fact, like you said, people that are abusing that authority. I mean, like the thing in Florida where the law enforcement was sent out to arrest people that voted who had been felons, and they found out it was completely a bogus arrest. It was like it just, and then they had lots of press there to make sure that everybody could see what happened to try and suppress votes. It's like that's
Yeah.
not something that everybody's part of. That's a cabal of people that look like me that are working on coming up with intimidation tactics to lower the number of people that are voting. It's like, we've got to be the ones to call on that. And to some degree, that's part of what I really appreciate about the work that I get to do, which is to really work with leaders and leaders of all stripes, but also white male leaders around, okay, what really is our responsibility and how do we, as a group or individuals, how do we start taking the authority that we have and some of the power that we have and use it in service of creating a world that works for everyone,
Mm.
not just people in our group. And the good news is, and that's part of what I love about this work, is there are leaders that look like me that are about that, right? And there are leaders that look like me that don't want anything to do with that, so we've got both. I'm curious, I think I talked to you about this before we started the interview. It's like, I'm always curious what people like you who are actually in the real world doing work with kids, because that was how I started too. I was a teacher. What's your stereotype or what's your view of people like who do corporate DEI like me? Like what do you think about when you think about that group of people? Because a lot of them don't look like me, right? A lot of them are men and women of color, they're gay or queer people, they're members of underrepresented groups, but there's a lot of us out there and we're doing this work. So just curious, what do you think?
So I think that I mean, I certainly can't speak for everybody, but for me, there's always a touch of skepticism. Uh, not much stereotyping, but more or less skepticism of not just who is in the role, but the power and investment in the role, right? And so the danger of DEI, and I say this as a person who's in such a role, the danger of DEI is that it can sort of go various number of ways. It can address safe issues and stay away from more hard issues, but be able to say, hey, we're doing DEI work. There could be a person who is in the position that has all the makings of a great leader in this area, but they may be handicapped by uh, their place of employment, who just wants to put a face on it versus actually doing the work. So for me, whenever I hear about someone doing this kind of work, whether it's corporate, whether it's in a K through 12 environment, I always want to know, one, yes, who the person is, but what's the investment made by the employer, the corporation, the organization, if you will? What's the investment made by them in this role? And do they mean what they say when they put someone in this role to do the work that they say has to get done?
Yeah. Well, I think that's valid, and it's a risky. What I will say is that it's for some, it's a really risky job. I mean, the statistic right now for chief diversity officers in corporate America is that they tend to stay in the role for 2 years, 2 years, which is barely enough time to start looking at systemic change in an organization, right? So, and they are, I know many of them, and they are really courageous, bold people who are having to almost every day say, yeah, that's not really what I said, or yeah, that's not really what we need to do. They're having to push against things and find ways to unstick the system when it's clogged and stuck. One chief diversity officer said, "My job first is to melt the ice cubes so that we can start being flexible enough with our thinking that we can try something new." But she said, just getting the ice cubes to the point that they're in the bowl and moving took me 3 years
Mm.
before people were even willing to look at, okay, now that we're more flexible, what could we be doing, right? So yeah, but for that group, for that same group of people like me who probably are detached and not as close to what's happening in public education, what do you want us to think about? What do you want us to be aware of? What are the battles that you're fighting, and what does support look like?
That's a really good question. I think I'll stick with a macro level in terms of support. Talking to your legislature, speaking to your representatives, all those folks, making sure that young people have the opportunity to learn real history. I think that that's so important in states all over this country. Even though there may not be laws on the books, there are politicians who are putting proposals out.
Right.
Even in New Jersey, we have a bill that's out trying to prevent the teaching of history, accurate history in this state. So I think that folks in the corporate world have a huge opportunity to stand for young people to ensure that they learn this kind of history. And so they should with their vote, with their advocacy, personal, individual advocacy, but also, speaking to the foundations of their corporations. Most corporations have those kind of philanthropic, social responsibility wings that deal with this sort of thing, and they can talk to them and say, "Hey, how much money are we putting to issues dealing with this?" And maybe we ought to consider doing that. I think that that's something that they can certainly do. but I also think what's key is that oftentimes when we have these discussions, folks are very detached. So it's easy to go down to the social responsibility group, send an email and say, "Hey, I think you need to talk about this," and leave it alone and say, "Hey, I did a good thing today." I think that it's important for folks to um, really do the work of finding these issues out, finding out about them for themselves, doing the research. There's so much information online that they can find out, that they can read, scholars that you can read, and things of that nature. Going on social media, following some of these scholars, like listening to them, looking at videos, looking at some of their posts, finding documents, things of that nature. And also maybe if they're comfortable going to talk to folks in certain communities, not necessarily looking to be taught, not necessarily looking for someone to do work for them, but rather coming genuinely to find out things. Maybe you don't go looking to ask someone, "Hey, what about this issue? What do you think? Educate me on this." Maybe you go to a city council meeting
Right.
somewhere and hear what's the issues being discussed and
Yeah.
how that's impacting the community. Maybe you go and engage in some sort of volunteering effort where you can sort of see how public policy impacts the people that you're supporting and helping. Maybe you do some sort of work for a nonprofit organization where you see the kind of work that they do that impacts people in certain communities, and then you get a feel for how public policy really impacts people who don't have the ability to um, put people in positions to work on their behalf, or folks that do have the ability to vote, but you know things are manipulated in a way where they don't always come out on top. I think
Right.
that immersing yourself in real life situations is a good way for you to begin to understand some of these things that could supplement your reading, could supplement your learning on your own. I think folks have to get out there and begin to do the intellectual work, but also do the life work, um, to really get an understanding of these issues, and then go back and talk about it. Talk about it
Right.
with your group. Maybe you invite other people that aren't in your group. Maybe you join new groups
Right.
and expose yourself and be vulnerable to the point that you're open and willing to learn.
Yeah.
People would be surprised the response to that.
Yeah. You mentioned something that I'll get. This allows me to get up on the soapbox about this for just a second, which is this notion that white folk, the way that we learned about it is we go find somebody who can teach us about it that is different than we are, and then we tax them to be our educators,
That's right.
and and we want them to share their lived experience. And I get that on the one hand, but on the other hand, the people that we're asking are having to describe their lived experience all the time just to get by. And
Right.
now we're asking, and typically when we start asking those questions and get people to tell us about their real experience, our first reaction is, no, it can't be that bad. Right. So not only do they have to retell the story over and over again, but they have to deal with our incredulity. And there's a myth, I think, that a lot of people have that there are no white people that understand how to think about this. There are no white people that understand how to talk about it, as if the only way we can learn it is by being with somebody who's different. Yes, we need, like you said, let's go out, community activism. Let's be involved. Let's create relationships and observe and participate in what's happening in our communities. And let's not necessarily over rely on members of underrepresented groups to always teach us everything as if we know nothing.
Absolutely.
Because some of us know nothing, some of us know a lot, and some of us, most of us are somewhere on the continuum. So that's helpful. Well, tell us a little bit more about the book coming out. And I don't know how you feel about, is it, you've written a book? Is this your first book?
The first book in a couple of years. I've self-published years ago, but I haven't done anything in a while.
Yeah, this is big. You got a publisher, you got the whole thing going on, and right, you got a lot of promotion of the book, I hope. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I'm excited. Like I said, it's a book focused on various stories of African American people, people of the African diaspora, even dealing with the history in Africa, to really discuss the idea of resistance
Right.
in and how we resisted. I'll share just a little tidbit. There are a number of stories in the book. I believe it's about 39. One such story, I talk about, probably more of a, not as much of a well-known story, but there's a couple. Their name, William and Ellen Craft, and they were both enslaved persons. And Ellen would be considered a woman who could pass for white, and she was married to her husband. And they wanted to escape enslavement, but they didn't know how they were going to do it. But because Ellen could pass for white, they hatched a plan. And the plan was that she was going to dress as a man and pretend to be the captor or owner of her husband. And so they hatched this plan. They got it together. They tested it out, and then they actually did it. They actually traveled from the south to the north with
Wow.
Ellen pretending to be the captor of her husband, and they made it up north. They made it up north. They and they escaped, and I hate to use the word live happily ever after, but they were not recaptured. They were free at that moment. So those are the kinds of stories that I put in the book, talking about other things, and the resistance of the book itself is more or less just really teaching things that students don't know. The
Right.
kids, the book is for students in grades 2 to 8, but it's a book that's readable for all people, even adults. And one of the things that I love about the book really is it's not just the stories, but I heavily cite everything that I've written. So I have about 400 endnotes in the book. And
Wow.
so want to learn more, if there's a story that you're like, wow, this is really cool, this is a really great story, I wish I learned more, knew more, the nuggets are in the notes where you can
Wow.
actually find those resources and maybe open those up and learn even more. So yeah, I'm excited
Yeah.
about forward to it coming out. It's almost ready and all of that good stuff, and it'll be ready by I believe the release date is January 24th of next year, right in time, falling in between MLK Day and Black History Month. So yeah, I'm excited.
That's awesome. And you had said when we first met that you call yourself a researcher. Now I hadn't really put that together. It's like, so this book was exhaustive, probably. How much time and how much time did it take to do the research?
Oh, well, thankfully for me, um, there were about half of the stories in the book I already knew off the top of my head and had access to the research for. So I was able to just grab it and I knew what to do. So that was quick. But then there were the other half of the stories that I had to think about what I wanted to talk about. And then I had to do the research to find those stories. So I'd say in all, it took about a good, I'd say a good 3 to 4 months to really put together. Now, thankfully for me, 3 to 4 months because I was off for two of them during the school year. We was off in the summer, so I was able to really put the work in at that point. But yeah, it was definitely exhausting because of course when you're putting something like that together, you want to make sure that you get all the stuff right,
Right.
and you want to do justice to the stories that you're telling and honor the ancestors, if you will, in those stories, and make sure that you get those things right. But that's fun for me. Research is fun. I love learning that stuff. Looking at academic journal articles and reading books. I know that may not be something for fun for everybody, but I absolutely enjoy it.
Well, I can't wait to read it. And Ren, I just want to thank you so much for what you're doing and the way you're doing it. And I want you to know that I'm not the only person that's out there that's watching or reading or being inspired by what you're doing. There's more than you know. And we're watching and we're looking for how we can lift it up and support you and do our own work at the same time. So I'm so grateful that you were able to take the time today and keep going, man. Keep going.
No, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to discuss these very important matters, and I appreciate you, Jim, for reaching out and just providing the platform to discuss with you today.
Yeah, thanks, man.